Hello, ladies and gentle farts. We are back for yet another episode of Geeks and Barbells. Myself, Captain Pooper Scooper, and Panda Bear Master. We are going to talk about one of the most irritating things that happen in society as a whole, really. You see this kind of all over the place, and that is a kind of degrading, a kind of disdain towards works of fantasy. Science fiction does not get this to the same degree. There are many, especially more old school science fiction novels, which are kind of held in high esteem. But most fantasy, from a world perspective, is not spoken about except for the occasional blips in the narrative, such as Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter. And let's face it, there really is just that. Just pretty much Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter. And that's what we hear about because Harry Potter was just this massive breakthrough success that kind of translated upwards from children to adults. It was really the first big smash hit movie franchise, really, of all time. There was nothing ever that compared to how incredibly popular Harry Potter was, whether it was when a book was coming out or when a film was coming out. Lord of the Rings itself kind of changed the whole narrative in terms of how could a fantasy be brought to life on film, and it was done so well. Especially the Lord of the Rings films are quite old, and yet they're beautifully done. But a lot of that kind of stems from the style itself of the Lord of the Rings novels, and even The Hobbit, which are much more narrative and sort of adventure style, traveling and discovering things as they go along. And so many people kind of hold the Lord of the Rings in a different, we'll say, bubble. And of course, it's also just because of the fact that Tolkien, he pretty much started high fantasy. He created it, and it was such a different perspective back then. He created entire languages for the series. So Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter kind of stand apart. But aside from those, most people, if you go into most schools these days, you will never see a teacher really start talking about in an English class or a literature class about fantasy novels. They won't come up to you and say, today we're going to be discussing the Wheel of Time series or the Stormlight Archive or the Malazan Book of the Fallen. And sorry, there's like a fly attacking me. So you will not get that from a teacher. And why is that? Well, it's because people don't consider fantasy to be literature. They don't really consider most science fiction to be literature. And why is that? Because it's not because it's a story. Because there are many novels that are held up as pinnacles of literature. And these are generally novels that are based in the real world. They are just following along. And let's face it, they're usually older books. And that's really my biggest problem with this issue, is that even though it's the year of 2020, we're sort of hung up on old books. And it's not to kind of shit completely on old books, because there are many beautifully written and incredibly well done books. And if you talk about very old text, so things coming from sort of the Greek times, a lot of what's really impressive about those books is that you can kind of see something 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years old that still applies to modern day life. And they're coming up with these first philosophies of how to live a good life, how to be kinder, basically they're coming up with morality for all intents and purposes. There's a lot of people who want to kind of say it's only religions that came up with that, but a lot of concepts of morality that we speak of and the kind of ideas that we have around how to live a good life come from the old Greek philosophers and other people. Not much from religion, because most people simply don't read religious texts because they suck. That's a personal opinion. Now, why is it that fantasy especially is kind of pushed back against? Well, it's pretty simple. Many people consider fantasy, and fantasy in all forms, not just books, but animation, online, to be sort of kiddish. And we've kind of seen a little shifting in that in the last 10 years, but still that tends to be more leaning towards sort of the superhero franchises. Fantasy in and of itself is still pretty small, even on the big screen and television, and in terms of being talked about in the wider sphere of the world. And why is that? Because as someone who has been a heavy reader ever since I was younger, I can, without a shadow of a doubt, say that I have shifted my perspective, changed, learned to be a better person way more from most fantasy books than I ever have from regular books, and especially more from straight up philosophical texts, even talking about things coming from Seneca and Marcus Aurelius, and reading any kind of philosophical or psychology text or anything of the sort. And why is that? It's because a good fantasy book, many of the most famous fantasy books, touch upon everything. Everything. They just will discuss socio-political issues, economic issues, class divides, love, and this is all kind of nested within a usually incredibly interesting story, which helps bring us along and cement these topics of conversation in our minds much more efficiently. For most of human history, we have taken in information orally, not written. It's been orally, and it has been through stories, and not stories of Bob down the road. It's usually been about gods, goddesses, and spirits, and all sorts of fantastical creatures and other things in the way we were explaining the world back then, to show the extremes, to show every single aspect of how life can work through a lens of mystery, suspense, and magic. It has helped us to comprehend, and most of the learning for most of human history has been expressed in this way. And yet for some reason in modern day times, we don't allow it to happen. Yet for some reason, it is perfectly fine to say we are learning things from the Bible, where you have angels and demons and spirits happening and ghosts, but yet for some reason, if we learn things from a fantasy book, that is wrong. And it really does not make any sense. For anyone who has read a series such as, we will say, The Wheel of Time or the Malazan Book of the Fallen is probably one of the best examples. The Malazan Book of the Fallen is a heavy, heavy, heavy series. It has been one of the most difficult series in my life to blow through. Almost every single book is between 600 to 800 pages long. They are dealing with deep, heavy philosophical concepts. There's never been a moment when I have been reading a book in the Malazan series and not started changing literally as a person as I read it. And this happens a lot. And when I love a series, when I love the story and I love what's happening in it and I love the characters and there's great development all across the world, it pulls me in. And guess what? I learn more. I remember more. I come back to the series. I reread it again and I reread it again and I reread it again. And these concepts really drill themselves in my mind. One of my favorite series at the moment is The Stormlight Archives by Brandon Sanderson, whose writing has always been quite fantastic, and it's getting better and better every year that goes by. And his Stormlight Archive, as far as I'm concerned, is one of the pinnacles of his work. And one of the characters, Dalinar, is an incredibly, incredibly beautiful thinker. Although, granted, we could say it is Brandon Sanderson who is the incredibly beautiful thinker. He is writing out this character. So Brandon has an incredible mind. So not only is he creating these fantastical worlds, but Brandon is himself an amazing philosopher, an amazing thinker of people and worlds and how people interact and the problems of what we would call good and evil and how to be a better person and all these incredibly important things, how to find meaning and purpose that he expresses through these stories and characters that he creates. And you just don't get that in a normal philosophy book. You just don't. That's not to say, again, that these books cannot be useful, but many, many times, most of the most famous novels I've read, books that I hear so many people, even people I respect, who I listen to in podcasts and watch videos and read their books, even people I really, really respect, they tend to talk about certain books, and yet I'll read them, they're good, they're all right, sometimes have very, very meaningful parts to them or places within the novel or the text, but comparatively to what I've learned from my fantasy novels, not even close. I mean, it's a simple fact. I'll give you an example. The Book of Five Rings by Miyamoto Musashi is held up as one of the pinnacle books by the Japanese, he's a Japanese samurai, of speaking about how it is to improve and learn and be better at things. It is one of the most dull, badly written texts. Some of that is because of translation issues, but some of it is just because Miyamoto Musashi lived thousands of years ago, was relatively uneducated, and didn't know what the hell he was talking about half the time. He was all scattered all over the place. The same thing happens with a lot of Stoic texts. As much as I love Stoicism, and I think it's a really important concept and idea and framework to live life through, many of the texts coming from Marcus Aurelius, from Seneca, and other writers of the time, I've found people to be a character, within novels, whether fantasy or science fiction, or even regular novels, to just better express these concepts within their story frame than just listening to someone say it, because it holds more weight, it has more meaning, it means more within that context because I'm learning it through that story. And that's many times how we grow in real life also. Many of us don't just become better just like that, because we woke up one day, we think a thought. No, many times it's because we get inspired by the people around us, by the stories happening around us, by people living lives around us. I mean, you see this all the time. Someone has something really bad happen to them, they take it by the balls, they grow with it, you see them, you live their life, you live with them. It's sort of, people say this all the time, but don't really internalize it many times. But one of the best advice I've ever heard is that if you want people to change around you, then you should lead by example. Just being there, yapping at them, most of the time will never change. Even if they agree with you, they'll never change. But if you live by the words that you're saying, action, it tends to change people. It's because you're living the story. You're living the story, and people are inspired by the story of your life, and then they change. So I really think we do a disservice to a lot of people around the world by kind of the way we speak about fantasy. And it is very important, actually, that it comes from fantasy, because stories, one of the biggest important parts of them is that they shift our perspective. They allow us to live within the mind of a different person for a while. Men, women, people of different color, races, examples, alien species, all sorts of things. And fantasy and science fiction, because they allow us to add in concepts that simply don't exist within our world, such as magic, such as different races, such as, simply it being a different world with different rules and different ways of being, it pulls us even more out of our comfort zone. So when these same philosophical ideas, these same lessons come along, we pay even more attention because we're so in the moment, because it is so different from our reality. And we learn a lot more. That's why one of the best things you can do is travel, is get out of your comfort zone, get away from your parents, your friends, everyone who you know who has a perspective of you, a way of thinking about you, a way of expecting certain things from you. Take yourself out of your comfort zone of every road that you know. Put yourself in a different country with different languages, with different people, and all of a sudden you have to take a hard look in the mirror at who you are as a person. And so the bigger the change, the bigger the difference, the more impact ideas and concepts have on us. And so that's why I really, really do feel like I've learned more from fantasy in all of its roots, whether through books, whether through animation online, all these different mediums, because of the central focus of like this massively different perspective point, has helped me to learn and change as a person. It's been like that ever since I was younger. I've always kind of thought quite a bit differently from my friends. And when I got introduced to other books, when I started getting into philosophy and psychology and all these other types of books and other mediums, I internalized them much more quickly because I had already had been exposed to them through these other novels as I was younger and at a very young age. That's one of the most important things, is many of these concepts, if we really want to talk about changing people and changing the way they view life and the world and their place in it and different perspectives, we want to start young. We do want to start when they're very young. And let's face it, you're not going to take a book of Seneca and give it to a 5-year-old. You can take a fantasy book and give it to a 5-year-old. And that's not because the 5-year-old is less intelligent than an adult. There are many kids, most kids, who are much smarter than adults. They simply are. They will internalize and learn much more quickly, and they can have heavy, even books dealing with very, very difficult subjects. It's just that they will take much more enjoyment from something mystical, something fantastical, something magical, than they will from a boring kind of straight up information book, like many philosophy, psychology, everything, but politics. It doesn't matter what the subject is. Take something like the Malazan book, The Fallen, The Wheel of Time, God, the Lightbringer series. There's so many series that touch upon huge amounts of issues that are actually facing us in our day-to-day lives, and they work their way through them in a way that can teach us a lot. And if we start getting kids in on this when they're young, it can change a whole lot. I know it changed a whole lot for me. It opened my mind imaginatively, creatively, and just has allowed me to be the kind of person who has a broad swath of interest, and I can kind of internalize information from a huge amount of different sources. And I'm good with that. I don't need to be this hyper specialized kind of person because of that. So this has sort of been my rant, my debate, my argument against this kind of pushing fantasy and science fiction into a sort of kiddish section in a kind of denigrating way, when in fact there are beautifully written works of art in the fantasy and science fiction genre. And if we made those be a huge part, a much larger part of our cultural upbringing, our society, if we talked about them more, if we learned more from them, we would probably be in a hell of a lot better place. Much better place. Let me know what you think down below. Let me know of some books, some series that you love, that you feel shifted your perspective, changed a lot of the way you think. And like, subscribe, comment below. Check out the website, geeksandbarbells.com, and I will be back soon with another video because I want to.